Welcome to the David Mers Experience. On this episode, I will be diving into the English language, specifically the use of stereotypes, the truth of stereotypes. Well, I guess just everything stereotypes. So where do they come from, what do they convey, and are they true? All these will be answered in the upcoming segments. Apart from some expert analysis, I will be showcasing some data gathered from polls and information from the internet. So let's get into it. I'll be going through some of the most common stereotypes and offering explanations and the data for each. Before that, I have psychology professor Sam Summers here. So Sam, why do we stereotype?
We stereotype because we get used to, at a very young age, seeing the world in terms of categories. Objects, animals, furniture. It's our way of navigating a complicated social universe. We have to rely on a variety of cognitive shortcuts to get through our day. Cognitive shortcuts save us time, save us energy. They also lead us down the road of stereotyping. When we jump to conclusions about an object based on its characteristics, there are very few repercussions. When we jump to conclusions about an individual based on her or his group membership, there are repercussions. People resent that.
Some interesting stuff there, certainly to be recognized, while there are the obvious negatives related to judging people before knowing them, but it can also allow us to view situations and evaluate this event quickly. So now we'll be getting into our particular stereotypes and breaking those down. Alright, starting off with the stereotype that Asian people are smarter than American or really any other ethnicity. The polls, which you can see here, are in favor of this stereotype. 58% say they agree with the stereotype. So, why does it exist? Asian Americans are, and I quote, almost twice as likely to have a college degree than the average American. In school, it is hard to say that Asian students are not excelling past everyone else. Quote, Asian Americans make up about 5% of the population of public high schools in the United States, and were 22% of those admitted to Harvard's freshman class this year. Asian Americans make up 26% of the undergraduate enrollment at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Okay, these two highly prestigious universities have higher proportions of Asian American students, and along with that, average SAT scores for Asian students are significantly higher than any other race as well, as you can see. But the reasoning for this may have to tie into the stereotyping. Asian stereotypes to be smarter and higher achieving could cause their success. Researchers Li and Zhao, quote, think that positive stereotyping may be part of an explanation for the success of Asian Americans in school. With people placing high expectations on a group of individuals, they are more likely to hit this threshold and thrive. Of course, there are exceptions to this, but based on academic achievement and testing averages, the Asian American student appears to have the advantage. Okay, next up. Are black people better athletes? Well, the polls say people generally agree with this stereotype, and the statistics seem to lean towards this way as well. Common attributes to athletic people in general are speed, jumping ability, and quickness. In major sports, it is safe to say that basketball and football seem to encompass these more than any other. But when looking at the number of high-achieving black athletes in the NBA and NFL, it is overwhelming. African Americans make up 12% of the US population. The NBA is 77% African American. In the NFL, skill positions like running back and wide receiver, positions that require the most athleticism, are 87% black. So this is most likely where the stereotypes stem from. White people watching sports they love and seeing the overwhelming majority of the athletes being African American. Apart from just sports like these that also require hand-eye coordination and strategy, track and field events are also dominated by black people. 28 of the last 38 world record holders in the men's 100-meter dash have been black athletes. It is hard to contend that the most athletic people are black, based on data related to professional sports. Scientific evidence points toward the idea that it is descendants of West Africa that are the top athletes.
So Africa is insanely diverse. But if you look at the athletes with the most explosive power, and if you like that includes the fastest people in the world who are in Jamaica and who are, in the United States, genetically you can trace them back to a primarily you can trace them back to a very small part of Africa, according to this book, The Sports Gene, which is the Biafra Coast. And so that's where you'll see the fastest, most explosive people. However,
scientists say that the longer limbs have contributed to a higher center of gravity, thus an ability to run faster and jump higher. African Americans more likely to be a criminal. Here, the polls say that they do not agree with this stereotype. Well, the roots in this stereotype relate to certain statistics. As I said before, black people make up 12% of the population. However, 53% of murders are done by African Americans. Facts like these being thrown around the media can certainly influence how a person perceives the black community as a whole. One possible reason for the influx in crime among African Americans is, quote, black people tend to offend more because they tend to be more disadvantaged, living in poorer urban areas with less access to public services, and so on. So it is harder to say that it is necessarily a race issue that promotes violence and crime, but rather an issue with community and opportunity. There is no question that crime rates are higher in poverty areas. The Bureau of Justice reports persons in poor households at or below the federal poverty had more than double the rate of violent victimization as persons in high-income households. And the sad fact is that in these poorer areas, African Americans had the highest poverty rate, 27.4%. These notions point toward the idea that it is not a race issue, but rather an issue with higher crime in poverty areas, influencing the actions of African Americans. Commonly stereotyped in areas of the Northeast is the Southern racist. And the majority of people polled agreed that Southerners were more likely to be racist. This belief most definitely stems from the South's long history with racism and controlling of African Americans, starting with slavery in the South being prevalent for a while and then segregation up until the 1960s. Most people from the North would agree that these actions are ingrained in the South's history and likely to continue to be acted upon. However, these beliefs may not be entirely true. Research argues that the black unemployment in the entire U.S. is 2 times as much as black unemployment rate in the South. Well, you might be saying, how does unemployment in the South show how white people racially discriminate by insulting and ridiculing African Americans? But it is nearly impossible to study how racist the South is. Rather, by looking at the impact of racism in the South is a better way of analyzing just how racist it is. Looking through this lens, there are plenty of statistics that show that the South is not exponentially more racist, or even more racist at all. Quote, of the 52 African American members serving in Congress, 22 hail from the 12 Southern states. And even in the Southern prison system, which many make out to be racist, is in fact not. Quote, we note that the states with the highest ratio of disparity in imprisonment are generally those in the Northeast or upper Midwest, while Southern states tend to have lower ratios. Basically saying that in the South, more African Americans are imprisoned, but in the South, in general, more people are imprisoned. So ratios in the South are actually less than ratios across the whole of the United States. Here we have the stereotype that has little scientific backing in its favor. Are men better drivers than women? Survey says the majority of people think that men are not better drivers than women. Now, looking at the data behind the claim for men being better. Men get into slightly less accidents than women do. 5.1 per million versus 5.7 per million. But it is not a significant difference. One certainly interesting aspect of this study is that men drive faster than women do. In Europe, men made up 90% of the speeding tickets. Now, thinking back to being better drivers, almost nobody likes to be stuck behind a slow car, or even a car going the speed limit when there's nobody ahead of them. And when they finally pass the car and see that it is maybe a woman, people may be more likely to say, well, of course, or women just aren't as good. But in reality, speed is not indicative of how good someone is at driving, although it is often made out to be. While women may tend to be less risky, slower drivers, this certainly does not make them any worse than men flying down the left lane on the freeway. While we often perceive a slower driver to be a worse or unconfident driver, this is not the case.
True. According to a 2012 study, men are responsible for more traffic violations than women in almost every single category, from reckless driving to failure to yield to speeding. Even scarier is the fact that 80% of all fatal and serious car crashes are caused by men. And when it comes to DUI violations, male drivers outnumber females 3-1.
That's all the time we have left for today. Thank you for listening, and make sure to remember a couple of these key takeaways. Just because someone is of a certain ethnic group, cultural group, sex, or anything, does not make them beholden to that group. Although it is hard not to stereotype, making an active attempt not to is a great way to try and break the norm. While some stereotypes may seem so widespread and so common, be careful before using them, as they may not be quite the truth you expected. Alright, that's it for the David Mers Experience. Thank you for listening, and make sure to tune in next week, where I will be attempting to explain everything there is about quantum physics in under 5 minutes.